Hello there, and welcome to Lesson 4, Rhetorical Analysis. The title of this lesson is Rhetorical Analysis because the main goal of this lesson is to go over, as thoroughly as possible, my expectations and the instructions for your first major writing assignment. And that writing assignment is a rhetorical analysis. Now, you should have some idea at this point of what a rhetorical analysis should be because we've been practicing the skill since we first learned it in Lesson 1. But one of my main goals as an instructor is to be as transparent as possible with my students, especially when it comes to major assignments. So this lecture is an effort to uphold that. There's no tricks or gimmicks with me. You know exactly what the deal is going into ideally everything you do. And if you're ever confused about something, please email me or come by my office hours. To go over the rhetorical analysis assignment, we're going to break this lesson into 4 parts, but it's actually just going to be one video. Each part is very short, probably not more than 10 minutes. So rather than giving you 4 different videos to click through that were all really short, I thought I would just record one. Going back to what I said in our previous lesson, that unless it's a fairly long lecture, I won't break it up into shorter parts. Here are the different parts, though. So first, we'll go over the assignment prompt. This is the page on Canvas that tells you the instructions for the assignment. So if we were meeting in a face-to-face class, I'd have these instructions on the screen, probably hand you out a print copy of them, and we'd talk about them for a little while. Again, with the goal of being as transparent as possible, going over them, discussing them, rather than just handing them to you to read, will ideally make them clearer or as clear as possible. Part 2, we're going to practice this skill with Captain America Civil War. So each lesson has been building upon the previous one, with learning rhetorical analysis in Lesson 1, critical reading in Lesson 2, using those critical reading skills to analyze Civil War in Lesson 3, now finally doing a rhetorical analysis of Civil War, and hopefully seeing a really practical example like that, seeing the work in action that I'm expecting to do will help you have a really clear idea of what to do for your own paper. Because Captain America Civil War is exactly the type of text you can analyze for your assignment. And then we'll look at how to structure your paper. I try not to be too prescriptive there. So in this part, you can think of those as guidelines, but there are some key things of putting this type of sentence here or ending this paragraph here can make your writing just much easier to follow and flow much more smoothly. So I'd like to spend some time on that. And if you've been doing the required reading for this lesson on Canvas, you'll see I've uploaded several student examples. So in part 3, I'm going to pluck sentences right from the student example to show you how this particular student composed the type of sentences I'm asking you to write. That'll make your paper just flow so much more smoothly. Finally, part 4 is really short, and I'm just going to go over some quick bullet points of my tips for writing. These are the tips I would tell any person in any situation, any writing situation, that is. So the goal of this lesson is to prepare you, like I said, for the first major writing assignment. The final draft of that is due at the end of Module 5. The rough draft is due at the end of Module 4. So ideally, you watch this lesson, you have some idea, how to write the paper. One thing I'll say real quickly, because I don't have a slide devoted to this, is the peer review process. It's very simple. You turn in your rough draft a week before the final draft is due. The next day, early afternoon, Canvas automatically assigns you some people. You go to the assignment page. Their names should be there. Click on their names, follow the instructions, review their papers. Do that by the following Friday so that they have a couple of days to review your feedback before everyone's final draft is due 1 week, the Sunday after the Sunday the rough draft was due. All right, let's dive in and take a look at the assignment sheet. Now, rhetorical analysis. You've got some idea of what it is, because we've been talking about it since lesson 1. And that maybe you might kind of have a look on your face like Woody from Toy Story here, because you're like, well, how am I supposed to talk about these things? Ethos, pathos, logos, kairos, and a paper. I'm really going to have to look closely at the text. What does that entail? My goal here, and it's ambitious, but it's for your face to look more like Buzz's by the end of this lecture. At the very least, to make rhetorical analysis something that's, not as difficult. So I want to give you an overview of how I write assignment sheets or assignment prompts, because mine can actually be kind of long, and I want you to have the information you need to be able to find it easily. So I thought going over the structure would just make that clear. So I always start with the task, which is usually 1 to 2, maybe 3 sentences at most, describing what I'm asking to do in the simplest, most fundamental way. So if you just look at the task, basically what you have to do, the rest of the document fleshes that out more. On this particular assignment, right after the task, I have a choosing the text section. That's just to tell you what kinds of things you can choose from to write on for the rhetorical analysis. Purpose is a statement that, whereas the task tells you what to do, how to do the assignment, purpose tells you why you're doing the assignment. So that can give you more clues about how to do it, but really it comes back to my goal of transparency. And you go into a rhetorical situation in college where you have a professor who is almost like a gatekeeper, an arbiter of a grade, and you need that grade to pass the class and move on. So you're basically willing to do, for the most part, what assignments they give you to earn that grade. I would like this class, if possible, to transcend that typical setting and be so much more than that. I would love for you to take the skills you learn in this class with you to other classes, to the workplace, to interactions with family and friends throughout your community, and help you be able to communicate effectively for positive outcomes. So I'm always going to give a reason why, a rationale, why I'm asking you to do the assignment, and that will always go beyond giving you a grade. And so I list some specific skills that you'll learn by doing this assignment that will be helpful to you beyond this class. And at the very end of the quarter, I'll ask you to reflect on what you've learned in this class and how it could be helpful to you in other places. But on this PowerPoint, we'll real briefly go over what the skills are that are part of rhetorical analysis. Audience. You always have an audience when you write something, and I like to list this because if I don't, I've gotten the impression that students just believe the professor, maybe their other classmates, are their audience. But to truly be successful, to truly gain skills that will help you beyond this class, you need to imagine a wider audience than that. So we'll talk more about who your audience is for this paper in just a minute. There's a requirements section where it's the real nuts and bolts, the real uninteresting stuff, but important. How long should it be? What kind of format should it be in? What do you need to include, etc. Finally, the last section is what I call the criteria for success, which is basically just a rubric. If you want to know how you're going to be evaluated, look at the criteria for success. And these are short, usually 1 sentence, short sentences, bullet points. So it's much like a checklist. Boom, boom, boom. You can go down that list, see what I'm looking for. So the task and the rubric or the criteria for success are probably the most important parts of the assignment sheet. But these other things will help you kind of see why I'm asking you to do what you're doing and give you a little bit more specifics to make sure you have everything you need. So just a couple of slides here to elaborate on these in more detail. I want to talk about the task, mostly just the task, so that you know what I'm asking you to do. So if you look at the assignment sheet, you'll see the first thing it says is compose a rhetorical analysis of a text from popular culture. Pretty straightforward based on what we've learned so far this quarter, but what does that sentence mean? Make an argument about how the creators of the text, the authors, do several things. One, most importantly, communicate its main meaning or message. So as we've talked about this quarter, all texts try to create change. And that might be real obvious if you're reading an article like the kind of articles we read in Lesson 2. It may be less obvious if you're watching a film like Captain America Civil War, but the meaning of it or the message it's trying to communicate or convey is still there. So once you choose your text, the next thing you need to do is think about, what is this telling me? What is the meaning or message of this? And that'd be your thesis statement, or at least the start to your thesis statement is, this text, Captain America Civil War, for example, says this or is about this. So that's the most important part. What is the text saying? What message is it sending or communicating? 2, how does it do this? How does it communicate this message? Through the use of rhetorical appeals or other rhetorical strategies. So ethos, pathos, logos, kairos, like we talked about in Lesson 1, credibility, emotion, logical reasoning, and timing are the most common and most effective ways to communicate a message or try to create change. But of course, there are other strategies too. So once you think about what the message is, you can think about how is it doing this, and then you can start to figure out your subpoints for the paper. Now you can cover all 4 of these if you want. That's how a lot of students structure their paper, or you can pick 2 or 3 of them. As long as you're talking about, I would say, at least 1 or 2 of them, you're welcome to discuss other strategies that the text may be using. And that's why I include that part of the clause, and other strategies. But if you think about most of the strategies your text uses, they probably fall under one of these 4 broad categories, because these are the most clearest paths to communication still to this day. Aristotle in ancient Greece came up with the 4 of them, but still to this day, they're the most effective ones. And I'll show you that in part 2 of this lesson when we look at Civil War, because I'm going to take the things I talked about last time with Civil War and show how they're examples of these things, kind of building on Lesson 3. Finally, also explain why this message is significant or important. So lots of texts communicate ideas. Well, all texts communicate ideas. But why is that idea or that message important? Why does it matter? Why do we care about this? You've chosen to write about this. There should be somewhat of a reason. Hopefully, in some way, you're passionate about this text or it's meaningful to you. So convey that to the reader. Pretty straightforward. Your stance or your thesis is what the meaning or the message of the text is, your interpretation of it. Your support for that, your rationale for that is the means, the method the writer uses to convey that message. That's what makes it rhetorical analysis as opposed to other types of analysis. And finally, why does this all matter? So real quickly, I'm going to go through the skills you'll gain by doing this assignment if you do it fully to the best of your ability. And we can ideally, throughout the quarter, talk about how these skills would be useful to you other places. Written and visual analysis. It's a rhetorical analysis. Obviously, you're going to have to go beyond the surface. You can't just summarize your text. And I'm also asking you to include visuals. We'll talk more about that on the next slide. But these analytical skills will be useful to you in all kinds of places because we engage with media on an everyday basis. And in most workplace environments, you're asked to do analysis in some kind of way. The next step after analysis is synthesis. So this is finding connections in different places, making different connections, seeing what the relationship is between 2 or more things. Going to be useful in lots of ways too in the long run. This will primarily come into play in this assignment when you're making connections between the different sources you use. Again, I'll talk about that on the next slide. But even just thinking through the example we already have of Civil War, right? I made all these connections between Civil War and the political situation in our country the past 5 years up to this day, and that's an example of synthesis. Critical thinking, pretty much obviously implied by those first 2 bullet points. To do this level of synthesis and analysis, you'll have to be doing critical thinking. That can help you solve all kinds of problems. Multimodal composition, you might not be as familiar with this term. This means writing in more than one modality. So because I'm asking to include visuals, you're not just doing written analysis, you're also doing visual analysis. You're writing in more than one modality, composing in more than one modality, because you're doing more than just writing, you're including visuals. And this is so important as you go into pretty much all different kinds of industries you can enter after the university. You're not just going to be usually working in one modality. You'll be working in multiple modalities. Including visuals can spice up pretty much any project you work on. Writing is a process. So these first 4 bullet points I meant to mention have to do with the actual composition of the paper. These next 3 have to do with the writing process in general. So if you're thinking specifically about writing, if you take these next 3 skills with you, import them, transfer them, extend them to other classes, to anything you have to write that's of importance, your writing will improve so much. And for that reason, I'll talk about them again at the very end of the lecture when we go over writing tips. But writing is a process. If you just write one draft of the paper close to the due date, the likelihood of doing really well on it, very small. So what does the process involve? In this case, it's writing multiple drafts, which is process means more than one draft. So what do you do, in between those drafts? In this class, you'll give feedback to peers. I talked about that a couple of slides ago. You'll read other people's writing, but even more importantly, you'll incorporate the feedback of peers into your own writing. So writing more than one draft, asking others to read your drafts, then revising those drafts before you do a final submission. That's writing as a process. That's the key to good writing. I was very naturally gifted as a writer, but in graduate school, I did not treat writing as a process, to the point where my writing got so bad, I almost failed out of grad school. And then what saved me was going back to treating writing as a process, doing multiple drafts, asking others to look at my writing, taking the time to work out those multiple drafts and revise them. And so again, we'll come back to this at the end of the lecture, but in terms of just writing itself, there's probably nothing more important you could learn in this class than the writing process. In many classes throughout college will ask you to do writing. Hardly any of them beside this one will require you to solicit peer feedback. So at the end of the lecture, I'll also talk about how to get feedback from others when the class itself isn't asking for peer feedback. I could spend an hour going over this assignment sheet. I'm not going to. So what are the other, in just one slide quickly, what are the other important things you need to know from this assignment sheet? Choosing a text. You can write on pretty much anything: a book, a film, a poem, a TV show, a video game, a painting. Think lesson 1 discussion board. Now, if you want to actually use the same text you wrote on for discussion board 1, or even use Captain America Civil War, that's absolutely fine. And I think if you do that, you have some pre-existing material that's a good starting point. It's always useful to just have some kind of basic material to launch off from when you start writing. So the thing is, the final draft, rough draft word counts have to have, we'll see those in just a second, have to have that many words of original content. So the final draft is 750 words. The final draft is 1,000 words. If you incorporate your discussion board post into there, unless you thoroughly revise it, those words do not count towards your final word count. But if you're writing on the same text, either the lesson 1 text or Civil War, you've just got some material to start with. So even though you still have to write the full amount of words, it could still be really helpful. That's up to you to make that decision. Audience, like I said, imagine you have an audience. So imagine people beyond our class, because if you think about just our class, we've been studying rhetorical analysis. Your arguments and conclusions will be fairly self-evident to them. To learn to write for an audience, to write for others, not yourself, you need to imagine people who aren't readily familiar with your topic. So you need to imagine people beyond this class. That said, you don't want to summarize too much. Summarize a little, as much as they need to know to understand what you're saying. But you don't want to have paragraph upon paragraph summarizing your text, especially if you're analyzing a movie or something with a detailed plot. Don't get lost in that. This paper needs to be analysis, not summary. Also, keep it professional. You're writing in an academic context in a university. You avoid text speak, avoid profanity, avoid exclamation points, most importantly. Avoid the phrases, I think, I feel, in my opinion. You can use the first person when you need to. I'm not against the letter I in papers in my classes, but don't say I think, I feel, or in my opinion, because it looks like you're not confident in your ideas. Just state your ideas like arguments. That's what I mean here when I say keep it professional. I already mentioned the word counts for each draft. MLA format, there's a link on the assignment sheet to MLA format if you don't know how to do that or you have questions. Include at least 2 visuals. Again, there's instructions on there. You can just copy and paste those into your document. You'll see an example of how to do that in part 3 of this lesson. But the main takeaway here is they are your evidence. So don't just put them there. Think of them as part of your paper. You're analyzing them. Explain how the picture you've included helps support your argument. And again, you'll see an example of a student doing that in part 3. The 3 secondary sources. Secondary means in addition to your primary source, the text you're analyzing. This does not need to be super professional. This is not a research paper. It's just to bring other voices into your paper. So it doesn't have to be a source you find using EUW's library. We will do that, but we'll do that for the second paper, not this first one. It can be the kind of web article that I gave you to read for lesson 3 on Civil War. It can be a scholarly source if you find one and you want to use it, but it doesn't have to be. It can even, for this assignment, be something more informal like a blog or even a social media post. The key is you have to deem it credible. You've read this and there's some reason why you believe it's important to include in the paper. Now, once you include it, what do you do with it? I say synthesis, which I mentioned on the last slide, as a skill you're learning here. That means making connections. So you're including a few sources that all talk about your text. What do they have in common? What view are they all sharing? How is that view perhaps similar to yours? Consider yourself the fourth voice here. And hopefully you're adding something new or unique. Synthesis and the inclusion of sources is a great way to show the originality of your thesis. And we'll work with that more later in the quarter, but you're getting a bit of an introduction to it here by using these secondary sources. Again, can be any source you feel is appropriate to include in your paper. And then finally, use the criteria for success or the rubric as a checklist. So go down that list, especially in between drafts, and make sure you have everything it says. We had a pretty thorough analysis last time of Captain America Civil War, so this will be a very short part of the lecture, but how does Captain America Civil War, what would it look like to do this specific kind of analysis to it? Last time it was a more general analysis, just critically reading it, extracting the message. We almost arrived at the message. We didn't get fully there. So now we're going to look at what does Captain America Civil War say? Why is that important? And how did the creators of the film use rhetoric to convey that message? Hopefully to be a good example for you of what I'm asking you to do in the paper with a text that, because of lesson 3, you're obviously very familiar with. So the meaning or the message is that disunity is destructive. This is my conclusion. This is like my own little rhetorical analysis. Maybe I could have written one for you and shared that with you. Maybe I'll do that in the future for this class. Right now, I'm just going to give you my thoughts via PowerPoint here, via lecture. But last time we talked about weighing responsibility versus freedom and playing the tape to both ends for both Cap and Tony, how the film kind of skews to Cap's side, but if we remove it from the context of that specific story, that debate can really go either way, and it lines up with real-world issues in a post 9/11, even in a COVID-19 world. But I didn't take his side. Do you remember that? I didn't say I think Cap is right, and I didn't say I think Tony is right. The reason I didn't pick a side is because I was waiting for this lecture. I wanted to build on what I said last time to closely relate my analysis of the film to rhetorical analysis, to give you an example of rhetorical analysis. So the point is not that Cap is right or that Tony is right. The point is that when they fight, when they can't agree on anything, that's destructive. The villain of the film sows disunity, and in a way he wins, because when the film ends, those relationships are still fractured. And like I said, this film, more closely than many of its peers and its genre, has these real-world political ramifications. As I mentioned at the end of the last lecture, I think our country is more divided now than it has ever been in my lifetime and in the lifetimes of older people I know, and that's not good. Division is not good. Difference is good. We should celebrate difference. We should find ways to work together. And that's what the characters fail to do, and that's what the film shows we should do through their example, the example of their failure. So if that's the message, how does the film communicate it through rhetoric? If we're talking ethos, Captain America and Tony Stark have all of this credibility, right? And they each stand for one of the two views. Freedom is important. Cap stands for it. Responsibility is important. Tony stands for it. The problem is they can't find a middle ground and work together. Pathos, the villain, Baron Zemo, manipulates both of them, gets them to do what he wants by appealing to their emotions. So you have this pathos-heavy scene early in the film where a mother confronts Tony Stark about how her son was lost in the collateral damage of one of the Avengers' battles. Zemo is preying upon that to push Tony on one side. On the other side, he's preying upon Cap's emotional attachment to Bucky. And by framing Bucky and manipulating those circumstances, he gets them both to do what he wants. So when you talk about the rhetorical appeals in your paper, you can talk about how they appear in the text with the characters or the writing of the text. You can, and that's what I'm doing here. But if you want, you can also talk about the impact upon the audience. How does the text emotionally resonate with the audience? Logical reasoning. You have the repetition of the shield imagery, which connects with ethos and pathos. The rhetorical appeals are very interrelated because it stirs the emotions, and it has that credibility by introducing Cap or evoking America. But the repetition of it is a very logical strategy on the part of the filmmakers to bring to mind certain things. And then, of course, Zemo's plan is incredibly logically structured, and like I said, for the most part, it works out. The heroes don't destroy each other, but they're fractured. Kairos, I talked about how the film ties into the post-September 11th world in which we live, as well as the 2016 presidential election. I also talked about how this idea of disunity and its destructiveness is very relevant in the wake of COVID-19, which we're still living through COVID-19, but I say the wake of it because of all the different things it's causing to happen, and that we've been a part of it for 2 years now. So even though the film was not conceived 5 years ago with COVID-19 in mind, it's more relevant today perhaps than ever because our country's even more divided than it was 5 years ago. And I think the message really resonates today for those reasons. So those are the type of things I might say in my concluding paragraph of a rhetorical analysis of this film to show how it's really relevant and important today. So ideally, by taking this text with which you're really familiar and doing a rhetorical analysis of it, even bringing some of the things in I mentioned last time and showing how they're examples of the film's use of rhetoric, hopefully it's a really good example to illustrate to you what I'm asking you to do for this paper. Now let's turn our attention less to content and more to how do you structure the paper. I very intentionally chosen this image because one of the most important things I can teach you with writing is how to structure your paper and make it flow smoothly. And the way to do that is through signposting. I mentioned before how I really struggled in graduate school. One of the things my thesis director in graduate school told me made all the difference in the world was you've got to give your readers signposts. We're doing this writing. We've got these ideas swimming around our heads for days. It all makes sense to us, but we give that to someone else who has not been living in our mind, and they could be very confused. So it may seem obvious to you and unnecessary, but we've got to put up really clear signposts for our readers. And in addition to the writing process, that's probably the second most important thing I can teach you about writing itself in this class. So we're going to extend this metaphor of signposting through to structuring the paper, and we're going to go over some important terminology, which are just words to describe types of sentences. When people read your writing, every sentence is important because they may not spend too much time on it. And there's different types of sentences you can write. And if you write sentences a certain way, the reader will clue in to what you're doing and be able to follow your train of thought. We're going to talk about those sentences or those signposts on this slide. So just like traffic lights, street signs, and lines on the road guide cars, our paragraphs and sentences help guide the reader. And if you can execute really well on your sentence design, then the reader will stay within the lines just like a car on the road. They'll flow all the way through your paper, they'll be engaged, and they'll get what you're saying. Maybe you'll even persuade them or create change. You can do that all the way to sentence type can help you do that. So what are some types of sentences? Starting with the thesis statement. It's clear, specific, which means it's a very narrow focus. It takes a position, and it's at the end of the introductory paragraph. You want to take a position. A thesis has to be an argument, a claim. If it's just a fact, it's not debatable, you don't need to write a paper about it. It needs to be clear. Use simple language. Students often, I think, get engaged with a thesaurus in Microsoft Word and try to use big words to impress instructors. I've encountered it a lot. The more simple way you say something, the easier it is to understand. It doesn't matter how educated your audience is. They're not educated on what you're writing about. Even if they're an expert in that field, it's your idea, your argument, your opinion. So say it in the clearest, simplest way possible. Take a position and have a narrow focus. I know it can be easy to worry about how am I going to write all of these things. But if you try to do too much, you lose focus. It's much better to write about one thing or something small in great detail. And I'll help you learn how to do it in more detail, but that'll hold your reader's focus. If you try to cover too much ground, they'll get confused and you'll lose them. Finally, why put the thesis at the end of the introductory paragraph? Signposting. Putting sentences in specific spots can help guide your reader. If the thesis is the first sentence of the paper, they won't know what you're talking about. You need a little context to introduce it. If it's the final sentence of your intro, then the most important sentence of the paper will be the most recent thing your reader remembers when they start reading the rest of the paper. There's three other main types of signposts beyond the thesis. the thesis statement itself, which tells the reader what the paper is about, then 2 more, topic sentences, which are like little mini thesis statements at the start of each paragraph. They need to go at the start of the paragraph so that the reader knows what the paragraph is about. If you wait till the end of the paragraph and build up to your argument, they'll be wondering what you're saying. You start your paper with an intro, some context, end the intro with a thesis. Then each paragraph has a really clear mini thesis. At its beginning, though, the reader will follow your argument in each paragraph. Then you can conclude each paragraph with a concluding sentence that wraps it up nicely, so that each paragraph is like a little mini paper, and they all work together to prove that bigger thesis that's at the beginning. Finally, transitions. If all of these supporting points, all of these topic sentences from each paragraph truly prove your thesis, then they're interrelated. And if you show those connections, the reader will see why and how we move from one paragraph to the next, and your paper will flow so smoothly, so seamlessly for them. Finally, paragraph breaks signal that the writer is moving from one topic to a new one. Have 3 or 4 supporting topics to prove your thesis and give each one its own paragraph. If you talk about 2 different topics in one paragraph, it'll be confusing. If you talk about one topic and you're still talking about it in the next paragraph, if it's a complex topic, maybe okay. And that's not as bad as doing 2 in 1, but again, your reader will be confused. They'll think you're moving on to something else. So even just where you break the paragraph, not even writing anything, just where you break the paragraph can be a hugely significant signpost for your reader. All right, let's look at these signposts in detail. Thesis statements. Here are the steps to writing a great thesis. State your topic as a question. Because we studied, is Google making us stupid? Couple lessons ago, I'm going to use kind of, and then Clive Thompson, smarter than you think. I'm going to use that as an example here. So if you start with a question, does Google make people less smart or smarter? You can then answer that question. Turn your question into a position. You could say, like Thompson does, Google makes people smarter. Not an ideal thesis statement yet, but you have a position. You have that argument portion of it. For this paper, you could ask, what is the meaning or message of my text? Then you narrow your position. By helping us find information that we used to have to keep stored in our heads, Google makes people smarter. Really more efficient, but that's what Thompson means when he says smarter, is more efficient. So you give a reason, a rationale, and that narrows your position. It makes it specific. This is specifically why Google makes people smarter. Finally, qualify your thesis. By helping us find information that we used to have to keep stored in our heads, Google can make many people smarter. If I just say Google makes people smarter, it sounds like I'm saying it makes all people smarter. You know, the other essay is Google making us stupid has shown that there's a pretty clear counter-argument to the idea that the internet and technology make us smarter. So we qualify it. It makes many people smarter, maybe not all. So start with a question, answer your question, give a reason why, qualify your thesis. You go through these steps, you'll have a great thesis. Let's look at an example from the student paper. The film Django Unchained is a great example of how using race and slavery from creative perspectives can create emotional appeals, along with many historical accuracies to captivate an audience in ways many movies haven't before. So the student is not named Fitzgerald. I just use the names of my favorite football players to make the papers anonymous. Why is this a good thesis? Let's break it into pieces. It has the position. The film Django Unchained is a great example. So the student is taking a stance. The film does something effectively. What does it do? Here's the narrowing the thesis or giving the reason why. Using race and slavery from creative perspectives can create emotional appeals, along with many historical accuracies. So the student is saying the film takes a really unique stance on a difficult topic, and it does it through emotion and historical accuracy. These papers, I should say, because I've asked you to read several student samples, are not meant, as I mentioned before, to be ideal examples or perfect examples. They're just meant to show you some things students do well. Of course, there's things that students also do not do well, because there's no such thing as a perfect paper. But I want you to have illustrations or examples of the concepts I'm talking about. Just like Civil War was an example of critical reading and rhetorical analysis. So I would work on the sentence structure. I think this could actually be said a little more clearly, but you have a clear claim. The film takes a unique perspective on the complex issue of slavery. And how does it do that? Through emotion and history. Those are the two primary rhetorical strategies, you could say. So you need an argument, right? People could say, this is a trash film, it's not good. It doesn't do these things. You've got a position. You also have to have a reason why. Emotional appeals and historical accuracies. How about the second of the three signposts, topic sentences? A topic sentence announces the argument of a paragraph. Good paragraphs focus on a single point. I mentioned that already. And usually the topic sentence begins the paragraph. You might ask, if a paragraph is like a little mini paper and the topic sentence is the thesis of the paragraph, why is it at the beginning of the paragraph? Because I said the introductory or the thesis should be at the end of the introductory paragraph. Here's why. You read the introduction of a paper, it builds up to the thesis, but that's maybe half a page. So you have the thesis in your mind as you go. The introduction of a paper doesn't prove the thesis. The body of the paper proves the thesis. How? By proving each supporting point. So each paragraph proves each supporting point. So if you state the argument of the paragraph in its opening sentence, you can then, through the rest of the paragraph, prove your argument. And then that'll make sense. You do that a few times. By the end of the paper, you've proved your thesis. So the reader needs to know what the paragraph is about before they start reading any of your reasoning for your stance. Let's look at an example from the student paper. Now, what is interesting about this movie is how we see a different take on the idea of slavers and their slaves. Again, not worded as clearly as it could be, but the point here is we've got a clear connect to the thesis, and we've got a position. So if you read the student's introductory paragraph, you see that their main point is that the film Django Unchained gives a really unique perspective on slavery. What is one way the film does that? Well, by showing slaves and the relationship to their masters in a very different way. And so you got a clear connection to the thesis, and you got a clear argument, position, and a clear idea of what this first body paragraph is about. We're going to unpack this more because later in this last part 3 of this lesson, we're going to look at how the student proves this particular argument. But first, let's talk about transitions. I've often heard from students that these can be some of the hardest types of sentences to write. So how do you do it? They help readers move from thought to thought, from sentence to sentence, from paragraph to paragraph. Topical transitions. A topical transition, think topic sentence, right? So you're combining topic, sentence, and transition here. Show the relationship between the topic of the previous paragraph and the topic of the current one. So if you've got 3 or 4 supporting points, what is their relationship to each other? If you're doing a rhetorical analysis and you're talking about ethos and then logos, when you get to the logos paragraph, as that's your second paragraph, what's the relationship between the ethos and the logos of this particular text? Let's look how this student does it. So we're going to look at the last sentence in one paragraph and the first sentence in the next paragraph. The creative, emotional aspects of Schultz and Django's relationship, paired with the affirmation of Django's impact on the issues in the movie, make a very believable and sympathetic movie. So the student has done a nice job of concluding this paragraph. They stated clearly that the movie is unique because it shows slaves and slave owners differently than most other films. at the start of the paragraph, and at the end, more specific, the slave owner here, Schultz, and the slave, Django, they have this unique relationship, and creativity and emotion have made it unique. And then you've got Django's character is very affirmed, rather than like a stereotype or something condescending about the character who's a slave, the African American character. This is a very positive, affirming portrayal of the character. And so it makes the movie sympathetic. We're drawn to this appeal of this positive portrayal of an African American character, but also believable because of the creativity and emotion. So we know what this first paragraph is about, and the writer has wrapped it up nicely with a nice concluding sentence. How does the next paragraph start? Although we see that this film can pinpoint many different emotions, so it's talking about the idea from the previous paragraph, such as empathy or humor, the specific emotions, there is still historical accuracy that further provides background to a film dealing with violent and tough issues. So this is a brilliant transition sentence because the student knows that the kind of relationship Schultz and Django have was not typical, if it existed at all, between slaves and slave owners. Usually, slave owners were very cruel and harsh and awful, and it was a horrible existence to be a slave. So Django's experience with Schultz is not only unique, it may be entirely fictional. But the film pairs that, it's using that kind of idealized relationship that may not even be real for a specific reason the student has talked about in a previous paragraph, and is pairing that with the reality, the historical accuracy of slavery. So later in the movie, we get a much more realistic portrayal of slavery. And it's the combination of those two things that make the movie unique and effective. So we can see here, one paragraph is about emotion, the next paragraph is about historical accuracy, but the student has tied those two together nicely. Finally, we're almost done. I know it's been a longer lecture. Before we move on to my tips for writing, which will be a short end of the lecture, I want to talk about paragraph structure itself, because you've got the intro with the thesis, you've got topical transition sentences at the start of each paragraph. How do you prove your argument within a paragraph? How do you prove that idea from the topic sentence? You'll probably see that in the required reading for today. In addition to the assignment prompt and the sample papers, I posted some outline type handouts of how to structure a paper, how to structure a paragraph. We've been going over how to structure a paper. Here we're going to see how the student structured the paragraph. And there's 4 types of sentences: the topic sentence, a little bit of clarifying background, the evidence, and then most importantly, the analysis of the evidence that proves the topic sentence. And those analytical sentences that come near the end of a paragraph, we call those linking sentences because they connect the topic to the evidence. And then you can usually have a good concluding sentence that wraps everything up, like we saw on the last slide. So here's an example of a topic sentence. It's actually in the middle of a paragraph, but that student's first paragraph probably could have been broken up into 2. But either way, it presents an argument and then proves it. Also, one key point in the movie is a moment of real emotion for Django that's immediately relieved with humor to appeal to both a sincere emotion and comedic emotion. Schultz offers to Django the ability to pick out any costume or outfit he pleases. So the thesis of the paragraph is that at a key moment, the film uses emotion, both sincere emotion to make us sympathetic to the character and comedic emotion to relieve some of the tension of the scene. And that combination of emotions really pulls us into the movie and makes us sympathetic to Django and Schultz. To understand how the film does that, before we get to evidence and analysis, we need a bit of background and context. So Schultz offers to Django the ability to pick out any costume he pleases. But for Django, a slave, we see a real reaction of suspicion, since he's most likely never been offered this by a white man, ever. So, in case the reason why this is important or significant, that Schultz lets him pick out his own costume, we need to know that Django as a slave has probably never had this chance before. Now, slavery is fairly common knowledge, so we could assess this out on our own, but this is a good example of a student doing what I mentioned earlier about being very, very clear, right? It's fairly obvious after we read this sentence that Django's never had this opportunity before to pick out his own clothing. But if we are just reading this and the student, say, hypothetically, didn't have the second sentence, would we think of that on our own? Maybe. There's a chance, but it's not a given. But the student has had the idea in their head, they've worked it out, now they're telling us their thought process so we can clearly follow their train of thought. That's why making your writing very clear, thinking about your audience, even if it's obvious to you, making it clear to your audience is so important. The evidence is the image. So for those of you who are wondering about how do I incorporate visuals into my paper, you see here that the end of the sentence, the student says, see figure 1, and then the actual analysis is of the image. So rather than a quote, which you could use a quote too if you wanted, but you need to have at least 2 visuals in your paper. You can have more if you want. You analyze the visual, prove your argument. That's what makes it multimodal composition, brings in written and visual analysis. We've been talking about the importance of that the last few lectures. So here's what we call the linking sentence or the analysis. You should usually have a few sentences to do this, more than one, but the student does it really well in this one particular sentence I'm going to quote here. Yet once he's aware that this really is happening, we see that Django takes full advantage of the scenario by acquiring a very flamboyant and outgoing outfit, which is more of an indication to Django's significance in this film. So the student's point is lots of movies throughout history have portrayed African Americans, especially during the time of slavery, in stereotypical, condescending ways. And instead of doing that, this film challenges those stereotypes by making Django this prominent, important, complex, dynamic character. Him wearing this flamboyant outfit that draws attention to itself emphasizes that idea. And so you've got a clear connection between the image, the evidence, and the idea the student's presenting. That the emotions draw us into the film, make us care about Django, and then we see Django prominently displayed when he's given a choice that most slaves were not ever given at that time. Here's, the picture of it. It is an awesome outfit. So hopefully seeing that student paper broken down into pieces like that gives you just a really clear idea of how to do rhetorical analysis and how to incorporate visuals is part of your rhetorical analysis. There's a couple more sample papers on Canvas that you can engage with for the discussion board post. Again, these are not meant to be ideal examples, just illustrations of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about doing rhetorical analysis and writing certain types of sentences. Please reach out to me via email or office hours with any questions at all about how to do the assignment. In real brief, I'm going to give you my tips for writing. And here's a great picture of this movie based on a book called Wonder Boys, where Michael Douglas is an author and Robert Downey Jr., Tony Stark is his publisher, and he's written thousands upon thousands of pages, but they aren't very good. And then he loses them all. The wind blows them away. He wrote them on a typewriter, didn't save them to a computer. But what he learns is that he didn't have any purpose. He wrote for thousands of pages, and he didn't have a purpose of focus. He didn't know why he was doing it other than that he had a first great novel and wanted to write a second novel. So Robert Downey Jr. is trying to chase down the pages, and Michael Douglas learns that to write well, you have to know what you're writing about. You have to have purpose and focus. So hopefully you can find something you're passionate about for the rhetorical analysis, and that would be my first tip. But here are my other ones. Take these with you to other classes, to other writing situations, and you will write well. Start your paper well in advance of the due date, not the night or the hour before. Why? So that you can write multiple drafts. That makes writing a process. Reread your first draft before writing the second draft. Take several days off between finishing the first draft and rereading it. Studies show that if you go and do something else, your mind keeps working on a problem, even if you're not directly focusing on it. So you go to work, you go to sports, you have time with your family, you work on homework for another class. Put the writing assignment out of your mind. When I go back and read things I wrote a month ago or a week ago or a few days ago, I'm shocked sometimes. Did I write that? Did I really say that? Writing is personal. It's hard to be objective about our own writing. That's why we need the help of others, which we'll get to in a minute. But we can be at least a little more objective if we put some distance between ourselves and our writing. So give yourself not only enough time to write multiple drafts, but enough time to take time off and do other things in between reading your drafts. Take a couple of days, do something else, a different type of work, get a good night's rest, wake up with a nice cup of coffee or tea when your mind is fresh and clear, and reread that thing you just wrote. Then, when you've reread it and marked it up and are ready to revise it and write your second draft, make the conclusion to your first draft, the introduction to your second draft. What? What do you mean? Earlier we talked about developing a thesis, and those steps are great. But often to truly know what we're trying to say, to find our purpose, we have to struggle through the agonizing process of writing. And we often find out what we mean, what we want to say by the end of our first draft. So if you take what you've written and put that great idea you have at the end of the paper, at the start of your paper, you'll probably have a clear thesis. Then you can revise the rest of your paper accordingly. I can't tell you how many times I've read a student paper and I was so confused. What was the student talking about? Then I got to the end and the conclusion was brilliant. And I said, now I know what this paper is about. How great would this paper be if I'd only known from the beginning what it was about? Once you've got that second draft done, what do you do next? Have others read your second draft before turning it in. So seek the help of others. You'll be doing that in this class via peer review. What else can you do? Visit the Writer Center. As you see on the assignment sheet, I'll actually give you extra credit for that. We have a tremendous Writer Center with professional staff that's incredibly unique at EWU. Take advantage of it. What about beyond EWU? Ask friends, family members, roommates, coworkers, significant others, anybody who you think would do a good job. If you don't think anybody would do a good job, just ask somebody. What's most important is having a second pair of eyes on it. Maybe you think they won't do a good job. Maybe that's perfect. Someone who is not going to be sympathetic to your writing is the kind of reader you want, because you're trying to create change. You're trying to persuade people. If people who know you well and agree with you and kind of understand how you think read your paper, they might not be able to point out the things to you that you need pointed out because, like you, they lack objectivity. My wife is not afraid to be a harsh critic, bless her, but it's hard for her to be one because she knows my mind so well. That's why, I seek out the help of the Writer Center or other people who don't know me so well to read my writing before I turn in important things. Think about audience. Write for readers, not yourself. Truly great writing happens when we make that change. We write something and we don't say, this makes sense. We say, how will someone else react when they read this? How can I adjust it to create the reaction, the change I want them to have? So think about others, not yourself. Thoroughly revise multiple drafts of your paper before submitting the final draft. And that's the writing process. I hope it helps you, not just in this class, but other classes. I very much look forward to reading your papers. Let me know if you have questions.